1626, in Plymouth, in this Pilgrim colony of New Plymouth, governor declares that periodically they would have days of Thanksgiving, days where they would set aside their labor and thank their God for providing for them. Okay. It was not an annual holiday, even among the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims arrived in 1620. They were joined by a much larger number of Puritans who came to Massachusetts in 1630. There were no annual days of Thanksgiving, though there were these periodic celebrations of Thanksgiving. When certain things would happen, they would declare a day of Thanksgiving. Okay? It was not an annual holiday. So the idea floats there in this immigrant English community living in New England. But this notion of a Thanksgiving persists. And so in the midst of the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress on November 1st, 1777, they sit down and they declare that there should be a day of Thanksgiving, which they thought should be honored on December 18th. So this is the Continental Congress. So try to imagine, this is the middle of the Revolutionary War, and this is the Continental Congress's declaration about this day. For as much as it is the indispensable duty of all men to adore the superintending providence of Almighty God, to acknowledge with gratitude their obligation to him for the benefits received, and to implore such farther blessings as they stand in need of, and it having pleased him in abundant mercy not only to continue on us the innumerable bounties of his common providence, but also to smile upon us in the prosecution of a just and necessary war for the defense and establishment of our unalienable rights and liberties, particularly in that he hath been pleased in so great a measure to prosper the means used for the support of our troops and to crown our arms with most signal success. It's therefore recommended to the legislative or executive powers of these United States to set apart Thursday, the 18th day of December next, for solemn thanksgiving and praise, that one time and with one voice the good people may express the grateful feelings of their hearts and consecrate themselves to the service of their divine benefactor. That's the Continental Congress in 1777. And the wording there is pretty important, right? There is no United States in the way that we think about it now because there's no constitution yet. And so the Continental Congress, in the midst of this war, giving thanks for what they see is almighty help for the military cause, recommend to the states to have this day of Thanksgiving. Well, we know that the Americans defeated the British in the Revolutionary War, and eventually they come up with the Constitution, and George Washington becomes the first president of the United States. And George Washington issues a proclamation October 3rd, 1789, in which he is going to declare there should be a Thanksgiving Day for November 26th. So this is George Washington, 1789. And this text by George Washington, because he's the first president, because it's the first year really of the United States as a national government, many presidents in subsequent years would refer back to and mention George Washington. Now, therefore, I do recommend and assign Thursday, the 26th of November next to be devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being who is the beneficent author of all the good that was, that is, or that will be, that we may then all unite in rendering unto him our sincere and humble thanks for his kind care and protection of the people of this country previous to their becoming a nation, for the signal and manifold mercies and the favorable interpositions of providence which we experienced in the course and conclusion of the late war, for the great degree of tranquility, union, and plenty which we have since enjoyed, for the peaceable and rational manner in which we have been enabled to establish the constitutions of government for our safety and happiness, and particularly the national one now lately instituted, this is referring to the national constitution, now lately instituted, for the civil and religious liberties with which we are blessed, and the means we have of acquiring and diffusing useful knowledge, and in general for all of the great and various favors which he hath been pleased to confer upon us. George Washington, 1789. Doesn't talk about the Pilgrims, right? He talks about a day of Thanksgiving to celebrate, as he saw, to give reverence for the achievement that was the creation of the Constitution and the creation of the nation. They would set aside this day. So why do we think about the Pilgrims? I mean, it was not an annual holiday in the 17th century when the Pilgrims were still around. It was not, they are not central to this holiday in the minds of either the Continental Congress or even George Washington. And yet somehow they filter into the national consciousness. Well, they do that because in the 18 teens and in the 1820s, and especially around the year 1820, various people, many of them whose ancestors had come to New England in those early years of 1620 to 1630, maybe to 1640, they looked back and they tried to make New England the centerpiece of the national history. Now, this is a strange conceit, I will admit, as a historian of this period, because there are indigenous peoples who'd been on the continent for thousands of years. There were plenty of other people Europeans who'd come to North America. There were actually English colonies in North America, some that failed like Roanoke and some that succeeded like Virginia before 1620. And yet this becomes fixed. And it becomes fixed because I would argue this campaign around 1820 and following to try to link two aspects of early New England history with what Americans are talking about as the core of maybe what we might say is an American identity. One, the Mayflower Compact, this agreement that existed between them that they would have a representative government, and two, the idea that they would have religious freedom. Because in this construction of America's past, this construction of 1820, looking back to 1620, this construction of America's past emphasized the idea that these pilgrims had escaped religious persecution and come into what they thought of as a new world, a New England, and had it there. So those two things, self-government and religious freedom as they thought about it, both more complicated than maybe people wanted to acknowledge in 1820, but those two things allowed this sort of campaign to go forward, and New England starts to become embedded in the American culture as where Thanksgiving happens. Fast forward just slightly to the period of the American Civil War. The American Civil War, this calamity that's hard for us to even grapple with the magnitude of what happened in the United States. 1862, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis both offer the idea that there should be days of Thanksgiving. 1863, Lincoln then finally, and this is where we think of the origins of the national holiday, Lincoln then declares the beginning of Thanksgiving as a national holiday. He does not, in his proclamation, talk about the Pilgrims. He talks about the sacrifices. He talks about how the terrible things that are going on. And he sits down and he says, okay, now we should have this day of Thanksgiving. He gives this proclamation on October 3rd, 1863. Just so you can situate where we are historically, because this anniversary is also just recent. It was on November 19th, 1863, so a month, about 6 weeks later, that he gives the Gettysburg Address. So no Pilgrims in Abraham Lincoln's speech. Pilgrims really start to appear in presidential proclamations in the 1920s. So here is Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1939, FDR. More than 3 centuries ago, at the season of the gathering and the harvest, the Pilgrims humbly paused in their work and gave thanks to God for the preservation of their community and for the abundant yield of the soil. A century and a half later, after the new nation had been formed and the charter of the government and constitution of the republics had received the assent of the states, President Washington and his successors invited the people of the nation to lay down their tasks one day in the year and give thanks for the blessings that have been granted them by divine providence. It's fitting that we should continue this hallowed custom and select a day in 1939 to be dedicated to reverent thoughts of Thanksgiving. And then this is 1939, he then goes on to discuss his understanding of the holiday. Our nation has gone steadily forward in the application of democratic processes to economic and social problems. We have faced the specters of business depression, of unemployment, of widespread agricultural distress, and our positive efforts to alleviate these conditions have met with heartening results. We have also been permitted to see the fruition of measures which we've undertaken in the realms of health, social welfare, and the conservation of resources. As a nation, we're deeply grateful that in a world of turmoil, we are at peace with all countries. And we especially rejoice in the strengthened bonds of our friendship and with other peoples of the Western Hemisphere. That's the fall of 1939. The United States had not yet entered World War II. Over the course of the 20th century, presidents more often than not would refer to the Pilgrims. Eventually, not always, presidents would also then refer to those other people, the Wampanoags, who were there also at this feast in 1621. So, Ronald Reagan, in his first Thanksgiving proclamation in 1981, on this day of Thanksgiving, it is appropriate that we recall the first Thanksgiving, celebrated in the autumn of 1621. After surviving a bitter winter, the Pilgrims planted and harvested a bountiful crop. After the harvest, they gathered the families together and joined a celebration and prayer with the Native Americans who had taught them so much. Clearly, our forefathers were thankful not only for the material well-being of their harvest, but for this abundance of goodwill as well. Now, in President Reagan's construction of it, forefathers meant pilgrims, right? So he has a rather narrow definition, as many other American presidents have rather narrow definition of who these people were who gathered at the first Thanksgiving. But I will say, in reviewing presidential proclamations, and you can find many of them online, Ronald Reagan more consistently referred to history than many others. He talked about ancient Seneca beliefs in a day of Thanksgiving. He talked about days of Thanksgiving that predated the Pilgrims that took place in Florida. I mean, he talks about Thanksgivings came later. I mean, he had either great historical interest or people writing for him who had great historical things. In 1988, President Reagan turned again to the meeting of peoples. And in 1988, he declared in his proclamation, the images of the Thanksgiving celebrations at America's earliest settlement, of Pilgrim and Iroquois confederacy assembled in festive friendship, resonate with even greater power in our own day. People from every race, culture, and creed on the face of the earth now inhabit this land. Their presence illuminates the basic yearning for freedom, peace, and prosperity that has always been the spirit of the New World. So here we see, 7 years after his first proclamation, a much more expansive vision, although I have to point out as a historian that the Pilgrims, when they got together with Native peoples in 1621, they were with the Wampanoags. Iroquois lived several hundred miles farther to the west. But nonetheless, I think the spirit of what he was saying was we have to be more inclusive. And then the last of these presidential proclamations, one that sort of gets us to the moment we're of, is the last one I want to talk about is from President Barack Obama, 2011. Again, just a brief excerpt. One of our nation's oldest and most cherished traditions, Thanksgiving Day, brings us closer to our loved ones and invites us to reflect on the blessings that enrich our lives. The observation recalls the celebration of an autumn harvest centuries ago, when the Wampanoag tribe joined the Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony to share in the fruits of a bountiful season. The feast honored the Wampanoag for generously extending their knowledge of local game and agriculture to the Pilgrims. And today we renew our gratitude to all American Indians and Alaska Natives. We take this time to remember the ways that first Americans have enriched our nation's heritage, from their generosity centuries ago to the everyday contributions that they make to all facets of American life. As we come together with friends, family, and neighbors to celebrate, let us set aside our daily concerns and give thanks for the providence bestowed upon us. We see there a certain trajectory dating back from the Continental Congress through Washington, Lincoln, FDR, Reagan, Obama, a legacy that sort of becomes, in some sense, almost may not increasingly positive, because there are always these sort of positive virtues that presidents were talking about, but one that is more expansive in its imagination.